Welcome back to the F Word, the podcast where we unpack the world of fraud, from petty scams to corporate catastrophes, with a little humor and a lot of forensic insight. I'm your host, Indiana, and today we're diving into one of the most misunderstood and frustrating areas of corporate crime, procurement fraud. Joining me, as always, is the man who has spent a career untangling the financial spaghetti that fraudsters love to leave behind, Dave Oswald of Forensic Restitution. Dave, welcome back.
Great to be here, Indiana. Although saying great while talking about procurement fraud feels wrong on principle.
Fair point, but let's get into it. What makes procurement fraud so uniquely painful?
Well, procurement fraud is unlike any other internal theft. You know, the type where cash goes missing or stock disappears? Here, the fraud hides inside the normal purchasing process. Approved invoices, vendor relationships, and payments that flow exactly as they should. And the kicker? The fraudsters rarely act alone. It almost always involves collusion between an internal employee and an external supplier.
So the fox is guarding the henhouse, as they say, and the farmer is selling the feed?
Exactly. And because of that partnership, the fraud becomes more sophisticated, harder to detect, and much harder to quantify. When we finally uncover procurement fraud, what we usually find is only the tip of an iceberg. A few inflated invoices, a series of suspicious payments, maybe a discrepancy between an original supplier quote and a substituted one. But that tiny visible portion, that's not the fraud. That's just the part the fraudster forgot to hide.
So let's talk about the evidence. You've said before that investigators really find everything. What does that look like in practice?
In most procurement fraud cases, we're working with fragments, maybe a few inflated invoices, a couple of altered supplier quotes, emails hinting at kickbacks, statistical anomalies, or a vendor who suddenly becomes the supplier of choice. These pieces tell us fraud is happening, but they don't tell us how much was stolen. Because procurement fraud doesn't happen once, it happens repeatedly over years and years.
So, there's a fire, but you've only found a handful of ashes.
Exactly.
Walk us through a real example, Dave. How do you actually find procurement fraud?
Well, a classic scenario looks like this. During an email review, we find a message from the purchaser to the supplier saying, for this item, add 20%. We dig further through the emails and we find another email which says, add 15% on this invoice. And then we see a third invoice which says something along the lines of, increase this one by 25%. Now, we might only find 10 or 20 such emails, and they may only represent $10,000 worth of inflated transactions. But they've told us two critical things. The employee is directing the supplier to inflate invoices, and the supplier is complying. That's collusion, that's fraud, and that's the mechanism.
Collusion. But the experienced auditor says, well, the fraud is $10,000.
Right and completely wrong.
Oh.
What we found isn't the full loss, it's a sample of the loss. If the company purchased $100,000 from that supplier in the sample period, and we found 10 known inflated invoices, that's already a 10% inflation rate. But if the total purchase from that supplier over the full period were, let's say, 10 million, then the real loss isn't 10,000. It's more likely to be 2 million.
So this brings us to the big issue. It's my favorite word, Dave. Extrapolation. Why do forensic accountants rely on it?
Well, because we never get a full picture of the amount of fraud. Because in procurement fraud, the fraudsters are continually destroying evidence. They delete all the emails, they make phone calls instead of emails, they alter invoices, and they clean up their trail. So all you're left with is fragments. But if those fragments show a pattern of, let's say, 15 to 25% inflation, we average it, use a conservative number, and then apply it to the entire spend across that supplier. This isn't guesswork, mathematical valid approach. When the fraud was systematic, The employee approved all invoices. The vendor issued thousands of invoices under the same scheme, and no logical reason exists to believe that fraud occurred only on the few emails we happened to find. No fraudster says, I'll commit fraud only on a few invoices, and those invoices I'm willing to leave behind.
If only they were that generous, right, Dave? So let's bring insurance companies into this. Why do they push back so hard?
Well, insurers want hard numbers. They want original documents. They want exact amounts stolen. When we say we proved the method and therefore the loss is 2 million, they often reply, if you can't prove 2 million with original evidence, then we won't pay it. That ignores reality. The missing documents are missing because of the fraud itself.
So this is my favorite. It's one of my favorite stories. Let's talk about Chubb versus Agrium case. It's the classic example of this tension.
It is. Agrium uncovered a procurement kickback scheme involving the purchase of potash and claimed the full inflated amount under their fidelity policy. Chubb argued that only the kickbacks pocketed by the employees were recoverable by Agrium. They claimed that because Agrium passed some of the inflated costs into product pricing, paying the full amount would put Agrium in a better financial position than if the fraud never happened. But that logic falls apart. Fraudulent overpayments are losses at the moment they are made. How the company prices its products later is actually irrelevant. And passing costs to customers doesn't eliminate the loss. It shifts the impact. Fidelity insurance is meant to restore the company, not penalize it for downstream decisions. The court stance created a challenge, but also reinforced the need to present these claims extremely carefully.
So how do you make an extrapolated procurement fraud claim stick?
Well, there are basically 6 key steps. The first is prove the fraud pattern. Show emails, invoice comparisons, vendor inconsistencies. Separate known fraud from extrapolated fraud. This builds transparency in your claim. Use a defensible extrapolation model. Objective, consistent, reasonable assumptions. Explain why extrapolation is required. Missing documents are the result of the fraud. Tie everything back to the policy wording. Employee dishonesty equaling direct financial loss. And anticipate your insurer's objections, especially the you pass the costs on to the customer argument. When done well, insurers understand that the extrapolated number isn't optional. It's what the true loss actually was.
Dave, final thoughts to our listeners?
Procurement fraud is structurally invisible. By the time it surfaces, you're only seeing a tiny fraction of what actually happened. To quantify the real loss, investigators have to reconstruct the scheme using what little evidence survived. Extrapolation isn't a convenience, it's a necessity. And when presented properly, it reflects the real financial damage, not just the silver sliver that was accidentally discovered.
Brilliantly put. And that wraps up today's episode of The F Word. If you enjoyed this deep dive into procurement fraud, hit subscribe, leave a review, and share the episode with someone who needs to hear it.